Good morning, everybody. This session is going to be carried out in English. If you don't know English, you can leave. No, sir. You can. There's simultaneous translation. I'm very proud to introduce Marcelle. Marcelle is a professor of economics in the Department of Economics at the University of California, Riverside. She's director and secretary in the International Association for Applied Econometrics, assistant editor of the Journal of Applied Econometrics, board member of the Journal of Business Cycle Research, and is director of the Center of Research for Economic and Financial Cycle Web, and is a member of the Brazilian Business Cycle Dating Committee. She has a PhD in economics from the top university, University of Pennsylvania, excellent university. Her research is in time series analysis and forecasting, empirical macroeconomics, financial markets, Latin American economic policy, development, and growth. And obviously, a top expert on business cycle dating, which is exactly why we're here. Marcelle, please.
Thanks for the introduction and thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm sorry I cannot speak Spanish that well. Desculpe, não posso falar espanhol muito bem a ponto de poder apresentar. So I have to do it in English. I hope you can all follow the slides. So let me start by talking about the emerging markets. When we talk about dating business cycles, it's a very different object when we talk about the US or Europe, when we talk about Brazil and Mexico and Turkey. And as you're gonna see, as I'm gonna be presenting along, we have a much bigger challenge because everything that can go wrong goes wrong. You have high volatility, you have a lot of instability, you have political problems, we have the influence of other countries. And so, whatever happens in a country that's more stable, in our countries, it becomes a lot more difficult because you have to deal with that. You have to deal with breaks, structural breaks, sudden changes in the economy, sudden changes in the government. And that has all to be taken into account when you're modeling and trying to forecast turning points and date turning points. So let me just start. There is a large interest in characterizing, predicting business cycle turning points in emerging markets. A lot of emerging markets have been doing that recently. And as I said, the emerging markets have faced very fast growth, much faster than the US and Europe, but also very deep recessions and contractions. And for example, the recent 2018 financial crisis in the US spread globally, but the impact in countries was very different. A lot of the emerging economies had a sharp but very short duration of the recession, whereas in the US and Europe, it was a very long recession. It was deep and long. So my point is that the fluctuations in emerging markets, including Mexico and Brazil, are peculiarly different. The oscillation can be more intense and also shorter or longer. So the motivation that when you look at the models and methods to produce forecasts of long-run trend and short-run cycles, the question that we have is, okay, are they separate objects when you look at Mex growing over time or when we have a recession? We talk about two different things or maybe they are connected. That is, when Mexico is growing very fast, maybe recession is going to be not as deep, or when Mexico is not growing very fast, maybe the recession can be deeper, or maybe not. So there might be a relationship between how fast the economy is growing and how often and how deep a cycle can happen. So the challenge that we have is that a lot of variables present non-linearities, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that. Also evidence of structural breaks. Breaks means that there's a sudden change in the economy and might not be related to economic events. But after that, the parameters are going to be different. You have to re-estimate the model with different parameters because the previous one do not work anymore. So that is also parameter stability, and we have a lot of data revision. So why is it dangerous to look at GDP only to date recessions? Because GDP can be revised. And so we have to look at a lot of variables in order to come up with an evaluation of how the economy is doing. So let me talk about non-linearities. What I mean is that there are a lot of potential symmetries underlying the behavior of agents. If agents behave in an asymmetric way, the financial variables, economic variables that reflect the behavior are going to be asymmetric as well. For example, you can say, okay, the central bank is going to increase interest rate right now. Would that be a good or bad news? It would be pretty bad because the economy is not growing very fast. But if that is done in the middle of an expansion and there is a threat of inflation, that's good news. The central bank is being proactive against inflation. So it depends where you are in the cycle. Changing interest rates or changing exchange rates can be the opposite in terms of the reaction that investors are going to have. So we have to take that into account when we are implementing monetary policy and fiscal policy. And how can we know where the state of the economy is? That's the point of dating business cycles. If we know the dates, okay, where recession ended at a certain time or recession started at a certain time, one thing for sure we know is that once a recession ends, there will be a while until another recession happens. So then in between, monetary fiscal policy can be different because, okay, and not only that, consumers, investors, if they know that there is no recession, they are less reluctant to invest and consume. But if they think that, well, maybe there's a recession, maybe there's no recession, GDP is not growing, 0%, maybe it's 1%, and it's minus, so they are not going to invest or they're not going to consume. And their reaction to it might cause a recession. So the expectations of, or not causing, but at least not make the economy take off, or might cause a recession as well. So if the economy is already in the edge, and investors and consumers are very uncertain about the economy, they might take a step back and they can have a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's why it's so important to have an idea where we are in the business cycles. So when we divide the cycles into stages, this gives us insight and where we are, then just look at over time. So, and also when you try to forecast, so you want to forecast what's going to happen to GDP next quarter or next year, if you look in the average linear effect, what's happened in the last few quarters or few years, you're not taking into account that we might be close to a turning point. And it's exactly around turning points that linear models completely break down. So they're going to be useless. So if you look at any linear model right now, they might not give very much. They're going to keep giving you whatever the trend is going to project forward. It's not going to project a trend that's going down or a trend that's going up. So for that, around turning points, you need to have nonlinearity, a nonlinear model. And another problem is the non-stationarity. So structural breaks at pulse level, and we from Brazil and Mexico know what that is, and I'm going to show some graphs very well. It's just like this sudden change in the economy. And we can have abrupt changes that can last a long time, or changes that can last not too long. We call that pulse level. But there's evidence that the long-run trend and cycles of financial and economic variables have several structural breaks. And that's the case in the US, that's the case in Europe, and also the case in emerging markets. All economies go through that, but some countries more than others. And there might be this interrelationship between trends and cycles. Maybe the cycles are influenced by the trends. For example, in the US, after the Great Recession in 2008, the economy took a long time to recover, and GDP took a long time to go back to the potential growth. It only happened like a year ago. And all the policies that the government were implemented were trying to make it catch up to back where it was. So let's go to emerging markets economy. So I have this paper that I was able to get because at that time I had access to it, data for the past for several countries. Now, if you look at them, you see most data starting in the 1990s, but this is starting in the 60s. So I was studying the long-run trends in business cycle emerging economies. So I put two here as an illustration. But basically, we find several structural breaks in the mean growth rate and the volatility And these breaks are related to financial, banking, or currency crisis. There have also been gradual shifts in the long run growth of emerging markets. So let me show Brazil, for example. This is since the 1960s. So this is the long run trend of GDP. And then as you can see, like as Mexico also experienced and most Latin American countries experienced, we have what is called the miracle years during the 70s, in which the economy grew at a very fast pace. And then hit 1979 and 80, Mexico had a huge crisis, and so did Brazil and other countries as well. But that I can see the crisis, is, the model is giving us this slowdown in the trend. But it's not only that we went down, we didn't go back. So that line, dotted line that you have there is where we would be if there was not such a huge recession. And then again, we had another one in the 1990s, and they have a break in the trend. And again, it didn't go back. I mean, if you look back all the way to Brazil, we're not back to the point that we were in the 70s. And when you look at growth, the same, there was very clear difference between growth before the 1980s in Brazil and after the 1980s. So Mexico, again, was growing very fast in the 1970s and the 80s, had this major crisis of the moratorium and so on, the debt crisis. And look at the break, and the economy, instead of going up, started going sideways for a long time, like almost the last decade in the 1980s. And the dotted line is where we would be if it wasn't for that. And then it grew, as you can see, in the late 80s, but not going back. When a recession like that happens, in order to go back, you have to have a huge speed, like you have to increase the slope of growth in order to catch up and go back to that trend that were before. But this did not happen. And so again, we had the growth, but then another recession was related to currency crisis, 1994, 1995 again. But that had a faster recovery to the trend than the one in the 1980s. And so this is where Mexico is, just showing that the overall, I mean, this is starting from the 1980s, but it would be interesting to do the same kind of analysis. Every time there's a huge abrupt change, as you can see, the 1995 and the 2008, 2009 financial crisis in the US, is like a huge pull down in the growth of GDP compared to the past as well. So what is the goal of dating business cycles? We first want to identify turning points. That is the beginning and end of these events, these recessions. If we're able to do that, and if you know that, okay, a recession has started, the government can, first, the government can try to implement proactive policies that can reduce the contraction or avoid the contraction, the severity of it. For example, if you look at the US, monetary policy in the US until the 1980s was interest rates start to go down after the recession started. So monetary policy wasn't preemptive. Since the 1980s, the monetary policy in the US is preemptive. Before recession started, interest rates start going down. So that's a clear sign that they are using models that predict business cycles and recessions effectively. Not effectively like they know exactly what it is, but they are implementing policies that are preemptive. And recessions have been very mild in the US, with the exception of the 2008, since the 1980s. So in a way, the policy have been much more, monetary policy have been much more countercyclical. So why is it important? Because of this timely identification can reduce or avoid the contractions, and also because firms can evaluate projections of sales and profits. So if firms, let me give an example, and I'm going to talk some more about that in Brazil. We don't know what's happening in Mexico right now, but we kind of know what's happening in Brazil. So let me go back to that. We kind of know now what's happening. The economy is picking up. But 6 months ago, 4 months ago, everybody thought Brazil was in a recession too. And there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of indicators, going up and down, almost zero, a little bit negative here, GDP. And so people are like, okay, speculating that we're in a recession. And what happened is firms were not investing. Investment in Brazil was going negative. It did not recover. And the recession ended in Brazil in 2016, but has been a very slow recovery. And the investors are not very confident in the government, confident in the economy to put their money out there, and then maybe they're not going to have sales. And the same consumers were, actually the consumers were the ones that were taking the economy on. They were buying more, but more non-durable than durables. But anyway, if the investor knew for sure there is no recession, okay, the economy is not growing very fast, but there is no recession, they would be more willing to invest, and that would speed up the economy. Okay, so then what else is advantage of studying business cycles according to turning points? We also have this transparency of information, as I mentioned. So if there is a committee, and the committee should be detached from political motivations. So it's very important that you have people that the public would trust, that are making decisions not because one candidate is about to win and then maybe there's a recession and they say there's no recession. So there should be a separation between political intentions and the economic models or people modeling it. So that gives transparency and credibility to the turning points. So then once you have these turning points of the business cycles, then coincident and lead indicators can be constructed. Coincident indicators are the ones that are going to coincide with the cycles, and the lead indicator are going to anticipate the cycles. But first you have to have a reference cycles. And then, as you know, in the US, the dates of the NEBR just take as being official. And the policy plannings by the government and by the private sector take that as what it is, that this historic, even though it's just some academics that make decisions, is taken very seriously. So let me give you an example of data in Brazil, just a visual effect of what that is. So this is the Brazilian GDP. That's the Brazilian growth since 1980. Well, there's some growth there. Sometimes it goes down, sometimes it goes up. But when you look at that graph, it doesn't tell you historical events. It doesn't help you visualize what's going on. It doesn't help you tell where you are in the business cycles. And that's what the committee does, a committee called CODAS in Brazil. We date this GDP. So we put shade areas. So that's what we do. So now you see that, okay, in the 80s, we had this recession that took quite a while. It was long. And then you have a recessions in late 80s, another recession in the 90s. And all that is related to political events as well. We are more sensitive to political changes than the U.S. The U.S. can have crazy presidents and the economy is not as affected as our economies are. So our president in Brazil say something crazy and invest are much less confident because the government has a lot more power to influence the economy and destroy the economy than in the U.S. because the U.S. is such a huge economy with so many institutions working that the power of one president is not enough. It's not to destroy, at least not too fast. But we economists have a lot of power in Brazil and Mexico to do good or to do really bad. Yes, a lot of these recessions have to do with political events, and like one president came in, and that because investors, like when Lula started, Brazil got into a recession because investors were afraid of what he was going to do. So the recession was purely because people were not sure what was going to happen, but it was a very quick recession as well. And then you can see that since the 2004, the recession was kind of mild, like 2008. It was a large dip, a decrease, only in the industrial sector. The service sector did not have a recession, and then went up quite quickly. But then we had this other recession in 2014, 2016, that have been basically the worst recessions in the sample because of the duration and also the severity. And there where we are, very, very slow recovery. But it's a recovery. So if you look at that, you see we are outside a recession. We're not in a recession. And then if the investors see that, and if the president is a little more stable, they would be able to invest and maybe help the economy grow faster. So I'm not going to go too much into the details of that, but let me just say business cycle measurement has been happening in the U.S. since the 1940s. So we started with Burns and Mitch in 1946. There are no computers. There are no calculators. And they studied over 500 series by hand, doing regressions by hand and everything else to classify the series into coincident, leading, or lagging the cycle. And to this date, what they did is still valid. Without computers, without calculators, what they did is still what people follow. They got it exactly correct. And so it defined, the NBR was actually created to measure business cycles. That was the primary function of the NBR. And then they decided that cycle consists of having expansion, contraction, and a recession. And or you can call recession a contraction. But the part of contractions is taken out from the modern business cycles, and people just say recessions, revivals, and expansions. So instead of 4 stages, 3 stages, and mostly just 2, just recessions and expansions. Because the revivals can be very slow or very fast. But the recessions are recessions, expansions are expansions. And so this definition of business cycles is considered institutional, and that's what's called the classical business cycles, because it explains economic fluctuations without using a model. There is an advantage to that, and that's very important too. Models are important, but having an institutional definition of business cycles that's model-free is very important as well. Why? Because parameters change, models might not work anymore. You have a model that might work sometime, but maybe there's a huge structural break. Another model is going to be better fit. So it's important to have also this institutional definition that is independent on particular model. So when you talk about business cycle definition, now let's talk about the how. It's important that we have in mind some of these features. So is Mexico in a recession right now? Well, let's check. What is the amplitude? We needed to be considered recession. We needed to have slowdown everywhere in the economy, not only one sector, 2 sectors, but everywhere. It has to be widespread. So we have to have amplitude. Number 2, we have to have the duration, a minimum duration of at least 6 months to be considered a recession, and a business cycle that is a recession expansion should have at least 1 year. So these are the rules created by the NBR. Diffusion, impact. So the business cycle has to be broad and affect several institutions. So you have to have the amplitude, diffusion, the duration, and displacement. Is another measure of severity. Is it causing a lot of displacement in terms of production and employment? And for example, employment and capacity utilization is not measured by GDP. So you see, GDP is not enough to measure business cycles. So once we have these features, then we can have just 2 points are enough to the business cycles, just the peak and the trough. Peak is the beginning of a recession, trough is the end of the recession. This is enough. And then how do you count that? It's important that we consider economic cycles as being continuous. That is, an expansion is followed by a recession. Recession has to be followed by an expansion. Otherwise, it's not. You cannot say a recession, oh, no, now a recession. So you have to have the time in between 2 recessions to be an expansion. Otherwise, you consider everything to be a whole recession. And so, so that is the popular reference that we have then is basically recession from peak to trough, the top to the bottom. Recovery is from the bottom to the point that you were before the recession started, and the expansion is after you grow, after that, beyond that point. So these are other things, okay. Then in Brazil, we decided the length of the business cycle, the length of recession apply to Brazil. Brazil has recession that can be less than 6 months. It might be 5 months, but they are so deep that why not 5 months instead of 6 months? So you have to adapt it to the Mexican economy. You cannot just take whatever the U.S. does. You have to look at the series here and what happens here. But it's important that strikes and other special factors that are temporary, outliers, are not considered recessions. These are just things that are not lasting and are completely reversible. Okay, so first step then, we have to build the reference cycle. The reference cycle, is going to be okay. The measurement of economic activity in Mexico, what is the beginning of the end for the last 40 years or 30 years, or whatever data you have, be able to do that. Then you find turning points in the quarterly frequency. You can use it first, the traditional method by the NBR, and then use models to confirm. But don't only look at the quarterly GDP. You can look at coincident variables to support the decision, employment. Okay, you don't need to have that many, and that's what I'm going to talk. Burns and Mitch for only 4 coincident variables. Notice 500. All you need is to have sales, personal income, industrial production, and sales and employment. That's all, and that's what everybody uses to date business cycles. So once you have the reference cycle, then it can be coincident variables and leading variables. So you can build some indicators that are able to predict turning points. So then you'd know, okay, are we in a recession now in Mexico? You'd have that lead indicator that will be telling that is before it happens, happens going down. Okay, so quickly I'm going to talk about the CODACI. That's a recent experience, but Marco Bonomo is going to talk a little later. So CODACI was founded in 2005, and was mirroring the experience of the NBR and the CPR in Europe. It's founded by Getúlio Vargas Foundation. The members are independent scholars, and the discussions are essential technical and not political at all. And each one come up with a different method, and that's the whole point. And then, of course, it might not converge at first, but there's discussion. And then we might converge to one point, or maybe there's so much divergence in that there's no clear turning points, and then we just don't make a decision. And then we have to wait until some data have been released, and we're sure that it's not going to be completely revised. Otherwise, we're going to make decisions something that's not factual. So let me just say, in terms of methods, what is the method that the CODACI use? So first, I have the traditional method. That's the reference. So we did turning points using the NEBR method without heavy models. And then several empirical representations of business cycles are used. So just to name a few, we have coincident indicator of the economy built from several models from the committee members. We have one that's weight average of monthly coincident series. We use a principal component, adjust to 36 months series. Another meeting, somebody can come up with a new model. We have a construction of monthly GDP series. We have wavelet-based indicators. So several different models. I, in particular, use dynamic factor models Markov switching applied to a small number of coincident variables, the same variables that Burns and Mitchell classify as being coincident. And then I get probability of recession at a monthly basis and business cycle turning points. I also use Markov switching quarterly on the GDP to kind of contrast and confirm. So I use GDP and I use monthly series as well. I actually can even combine GDP with monthly series in a model that has allow for mixed frequency too. But these models, I'm going to explain in a minute, they allow for nonlinearities. But let me just give you what the CODACI dating is. So we got these recessions. We cannot do a a lot of analysis on that. How long does it last? What was the loss that we have from peak to trough? What is the average variation? So then here you can see how severe it was. What was the displacement? What is the duration? And you kind of can have an idea for the future what can happen. Oh, we could have a recession that only lasts 2 quarters. We can have a recession that lasts 11 quarters. But we don't have any recession that lasts more than that. So, if you're in a recession for 11 quarters, chances are that you're going to be out of that recession. So, this also helps give duration. So there's a probability of being a recession, given that the expansion is very long, like in the U.S. Everybody's speculating the U.S. should be in a recession very soon because the expansion has lasted a long time. And it's kind of like materializing slowly to that. The point is, we don't know when it's going to happen. We know for sure it's going to happen because after recession, always after an expansion, always a recession happens. So we know that. We just don't know when. But so this is what the dating does. It gives a lot of material to study and to predict the future as well. Okay, so then another thing is we have uncertainty regarding the current state of the economy. The question that we want to know is that a pattern that is going to continue? Is the economy weakening or is going to be straining? So we can interpret this low growth phase in Mexico as a more severe recession. And if they continue to believe that that's true, or even that a recession has not ended, they might act on it and end up causing a recession because consumption and investment is a very important part of GDP. Many times people ask me, and they still do, so when is going to be a recession? So I have my co-author. He was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for Trump. And so Marcelle, are we in a recession or not? Are we going to be in a recession? No, we are not in a recession, I'll tell him. When are we going to be in a recession? And that's a very big responsibility for me to tell him. As my co-author, I had no problem, but to tell him as the chair is. So I said, let me run some models. I ran some models, and but you see, some models work sometimes and not all the times. Like the yield curve, because the government is changing the purchase of bonds, it might be ineffective. So like in Mexico, if you want to use models, you have to be careful and look at what happened to the economy, to the model, to the government, to the variables to see if it's going to be a good prediction. But anyway, so I myself found that I would say, I think the economy is in a recession, or I think the economy is in expansion. And then I go and run the models like, oh, it's not at all. I was wrong. And even though I have the data in front of me, when you put the data together, you might come up with a different probability of recession. So that's why models are important, because they're objective and they tell you not based on one variable, but several variables that might be going to opposite directions. So in terms of a selection of variables, the NBR used 4 series, applies GDP, industrial production, manufacturing, trade sales, real personal income, employment. Now, if you put 100 variables, but we might not be doing it, actually not doing a good favor at all in terms of defining business cycles. You're going to find that you put in variables that might be anticipating a cycle, or variables that are lagging. Like unemployment is a lagging variable. It happens after the fact. People are fired after the economy, the firm already lost a lot of profit. The economy is already in a recession, then unemployment starts hitting really hard. But for example, we put unemployment together with sales, and then the unemployment is still going down, and then sales is going down. So when you put that together, you're offsetting the cycle, offsetting the information of one series with the other, because they're giving non-synchronous information. So it's very important to put together only series that are moving cyclically together. If you put the leading variables, again, the leading variable is going to mix the signal information that you could extract from the coincident variables. So, in other words, we have this paper that we started with a large number of variables to predict nominal GDP in the US. And if we start with like 100, and then we come up with like 6 or the best. And if we add the variables, the prediction went down, not up. So we started like adding one and not, and then it's like, okay, we're just fine with the small number of variables. So there's a lot of people talking about large models, principal component. Let's put everything that we know. That's not how it works. You put garbage in, you get garbage out. So here I just want to show you the variables. So look at that. So this is low recovery in Brazil, and I was putting this together to present last year. And then, last year. And then I'm like, okay, so what's happening in Brazil? Okay, when you look at that, you have no idea, right? One is going up, the other is going down. The other one's made a shape. So what do? You get all these variables and put in a model, not just maybe put only 4, and the model is going to tell what's happening. So this is what is real when we look at the series. They're all over the place. So I use this model because it's been very successful. So we don't change what is winning. That's what we say in soccer. You don't change the team that's winning. So I produce these turning points in real time. And when the economy is close to recession, I start putting probability there recession. But we produce that and put it at the St. Louis Fed every month. So this is what we have here. If you Google Chauvet probability of recession, you go either my page or this one in the Fed. So this is the probability of recession right now is basically 0 in the U.S. So this is the shaded area is the recessions in the U.S. and the graph is the probability of recession from 0 to 100%. As you can see, the model capture every time there is a recession, the probability goes up quite a bit. In this model here, it's smoothed, so it's not the real-time one. So that's why the 2000 recession is very small, the probability, because it was a mild recession compared to 2008. So the probability also tells you how severe the recession is. So this model is called dynamic factor models Markov switching, has been very successful. So what this model does, it put together 4 variables or 5, and that are correlated with each other, highly correlated. They are all coincident variables, and extract whatever they have in common. So I don't care if sales is going down. I only care if sales is going down if employment is going down and then personal income is going down. All of them are going down. Otherwise, you're extracting sectoral changes in one of the variables instead of the whole picture of the whole economy. So the model does that. It extracts the common cyclical correlation of these coincident variables. In addition, it is a nonlinear model. It allows the growth to be positive or negative and allow the parameters to be different when you have a positive growth or negative growth. And also gives the probability of switching from this high growth to low growth. So automatically, you get a coincident indicator of the economy coming out of that and the probabilities of recession. So this method has been applied to several countries, including Mexico, in this paper that I have. I didn't want to show that because I didn't have the most current one. This paper was written in 2011. And I'll let you guys do it, or if you want, I can give you later my results from next. So in terms of for Brazil, I have done that for Brazil. It has been very successful. All recessions are well characterized. So if you look at the Brazilian recessions, the shaded area, this is the model. As you can see, the probabilities go up and down. Is it wrong that the probability is going up and down in the middle of a recession? No, it's not. It just shows that in the middle of recession, there was a high growth. But we consider that to be a whole recession. So the probabilities are telling exactly what's happening in the economy. So you have to go deeper than just the shaded area to see what really happens in the economy. And this is the last one, as you can see here. And you can see the bottom is like, we are not in a recession, but the recovery is kind of slow. So this is the probability of recession, and you put together with the GDP, it gives a much bigger picture of what we are in the economy, where GDP is. But again, this is not based on GDP. It's based on GDP monthly series as well. Okay, so let's see what is an example of why a model it can be important, because the recovery in Brazil has been very fragile, as I said. In May 2018. There was a truck drivers' strike. They stopped the country. everybody got completely shocked that truck drivers could have that much power. They stopped the roads, they stopped delivery, and they did not allow anybody to cross the roads. And so we ended up with no gasoline. Food was going down, and then people could not put gas in their cars. And it was like a war zone. And then that lasted for a long time, too long. And the government was caught, like in Chile right now, they're caught by surprise that the strike and protest can do so much. So the economy stopped for 3 weeks. And then people say, okay, there was a wave of pessimism because the economy was already recovering very slowly. And then on top of that, this wave of pessimism, that's it. Investors stopped investing. And then investment went quite a bit down, and consumers said, no, we cannot consume at all. So then what happened? We don't know. So let me just show you what the model says. If you look at the month's probabilities of recession, okay, we were not in a recession in 2018. But look what happened in May. The recession went up from 0% to 98%. So in May, there was a chance, or 98% chance that we were in a recession. And then if you look at quarterly probabilities of recession, the quarterly did not go up. So what happened? That month, there was a strike. So this was an outlier. The next month, the probability of recession went to 0. So that's what is important, is that a model can distinguish between outliers, small changes, sudden changes, and long changes as well. So basically, you can object assessment, the traditional math, but also a model that can shed light on where we are. Okay, in conclusions, challenge and goals. So basically, we are talking about Mexico, we talk about Brazil. We have to take into account that these economies have more structural breaks, has more stability, has more time variant parameters. So we have to use models that are fit for our reality, for our economy. We cannot be using linear model, and AR1 model or DSG model might not work at all because they project linearly. And even though the DSG is non-linear, but when you put it down, it's linearized and is very bad at turning points. So another point is that the possible interrelation between trend and cycles. So you have to be looking at it. So while we are in Mexico, is there a trend break? Why the economy is slowing down? Why is it so slow? Is that because the trend is slow? Is like a long term, or is that because we're getting a recession? So those are questions that you have to ask and have models to do that. And so the presence of potential breaks is very important for the prediction of business cycles. And then if you don't take that into account, the probability of recessions from the models are not going to work. They are going to give you very wrong information too. And I have some models that can show that. So you do have to have time varying, you have to have nonlinearities, you have to have asymmetries, you have to have non-stationarities in order to be able to predict the future. I mean, to predict the past is easy, you don't need any of that. But to predict the future, you do. And so in conclusion, basically need to construct models of coincident indicators of business cycles that are fitted for the emerging markets. And the goal in the end is like once you have the dating of business cycles, you have the traditional method, is to build models and coincident lead indicators coming from this model that give a formal framework that allow you to predict business cycles at the time the events are happening. So right now, run the model and see what's happening to Mexico right now. So you would have an answer for that, several answers actually, from several different models. And so these models have been proven to predict recession probability way before most other ones, as soon as data is released, and that the most valuable around the beginning and end of recessions and during economic recoveries, mainly when they are slow recoveries. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcelle. Very, very interesting and very encouraging for the work that we are doing in our own group here to determine the characteristics of a dating committee. A couple things I think that are very interesting and I'd like to highlight. Number one is I think that the big aim here that we have in trying to form a committee here in our own country is the fact that it improves transparency and communication. I think that has to be definitely a key point, something that we have to put almost in first place. And that's kind of one of the reasons why we are trying to do this, to be able to communicate better to our audience and at the same time do it in the most transparent way. I also like the fact that Michelle and Marcelle and the Brazilian committee uses Burns and Mitchell's definition because, first of all, it's considered to be institutional. It's not media-driven. It uses the classical business cycle approach from the NBER, which is, I think, exactly what we have to do here. I think implicitly the growth cycle methodology is, in the best of cases, only a complement, but not necessarily the basis to try and map out the business cycle. And probably more important than anything else is the fact that she underlined that it is not dependent on a particular theory or model. And I think that is something that is very important to underline. INEGI calculated its first composite index of coincidental indicators in 2000 using the classical business approach. I remember very well, I met that with huge enthusiasm. And there was a seminar here not here in INEGI, in Aguascalientes. I think it must have been in 2001. And I remember participating, and I asked to give a presentation precisely on this new indicator that mapped out the business cycle. And I remember giving a very enthusiastic presentation. And at that moment, the president of INEGI was present and kind of taking notes, which I thought was kind of interesting because it's kind of usually wasn't the case in those types of seminars. And many years later, about 10 years later, Blanca Sainz in INEGI confessed to me that was a turning point in INEGI because the president of INEGI was a newcomer. He had a lot of pressure to reduce costs and to maybe eliminate a lot of indicators that were only marginal at the best of cases. And one of the ones that he had in sight to eliminate was this new composite indicator of coincidental indicators. And he had already just about made the decision to trash it. And after listening to my presentation, he decided not to, and they continued along with that, which was something that, wow, I never understood the impact of a presentation that I made 10 years later. And then basically about that same time, INEGI made a decision, which I never really agreed with, to change the approach from using the classical business cycle approach to adopting the growth cycle approach. I think that it was a step backwards, especially because at the beginning they didn't really explain exactly the difference between the two. I think that they liked it was very colorful and had this like watch with like you could play a game showing the cycles, and I think that captivated the attention, but I think it lost sight of what was really important. And as you all remember, a little unfortunate also was they used the labels of recession to describe the amplitude of the negative gap. And that created a lot of controversy in 2013. And then they finally had to, with their tail between their legs, say, no, okay, it isn't a recession and we have to change and eliminate those labels. So we've gone through a lot. And I think that it's been now quite a while where we definitely need to come up with a business cycle dating committee. And I think that's a lot of the points here that Marcelle has put forth is definitely gives us a lot of intellectual material to finish our work. Marcelle outlined 4 factors, which are very important, and we can take as a very interesting kind of starting point in our own discussion right now of whether Mexico is entering into a recession or not. And with these 4 factors, I think it's very easy to just underline the fact that we are definitely not in a recession. And in the best of cases, maybe a recession watch because we're still kind of going down and the recovery isn't in sight. and we're definitely in a stagnant phase, but we're definitely not in a recession. The first one was duration, and it says that a recession should last at least 6 months. I think we've kind of identified a peak in September of last year using the classical approach. And that means that we now have, with the latest data, 10 consecutive months where we have a definite downward trend. 11, maybe, I think in a week, the new number will come out for August. And that's the only one of the four that definitely classifies to say that maybe we might be in a recession. The amplitude, depth, is definitely not there. We had a big, huge media explosion, as you all know, especially when the second quarter GDP was about to come out, because the first quarter had been negative and once the second quarter was negative, and using this mediatic rule of thumb approach of 2 consecutive quarters, they were going to see whether we were in a recession or not. And the second quarter came out with a growth rate, a positive growth rate of 0.02. And so we all know that our president was really happy and almost had a party, and it was a big celebration that we weren't in a recession. Obviously, if the number had been negative 0.02, the media would have probably said we were in a recession, and that is way less than any statistical probability of an error measurement. And it's kind of stupid if we're roughly around zero to think that we're anywhere near a significant drop. The other factor, which is diffusion, is also very important because we're nowhere near a generalized or a broad drop in economic activity. Our industrial production is definitely dropping. However, very important, and a lot of people forget about this, industrial production in the U.S. does not include construction, while here in Mexico we do include construction. And construction is the one sector that is definitely significantly dropping. It is just like on a free fall. But it's basically the only sector in the economy that's doing that. Another very important sector of industrial production is mining. And mining is also falling, but it's been falling for 10 years, and it has nothing to do with the business cycle. It's a structural drop. So we have to distinguish between a structural drop in one sector that is contributing to a momentarily drop in industrial production, and we really can't call that a characteristic of a significant drop in industrial production. And if we look at retail sales and manufacturing, they're growing, even if it's a very mediocre rate, but they're growing. So we definitely, and employment also is maybe marginally increased. Our rate of unemployment has increased, I can't remember, a few decimal points, but is still below at least the central bank's calculation of what a NAIRU unemployment rate would be. So if we're underneath a NAIRU, it's really hard to think that we could even begin to talk about a recession. So I think these characteristics are very interesting, and it puts a lot of material on the board. And I think that it definitely helps us dispel the fact that we're in a recession right now, which is obviously going to be a very important part of our new dating committee. However, I think that probably the biggest contribution of Marcelle's talk is all her studies and what she's put into in terms of real-time assessment. I think that that's one of the very most controversial aspects right now, because we are going to come up with maybe a business dating committee that will maybe 2 years later say, yes, we were in a recession, remember? And that definitely, from an academic point of view, is very helpful, but maybe from what everybody is expecting of our dating committee is really could be a major disappointment. Real-time assessment of economic conditions can be severely jeopardized, obviously, because we have to wait a long time because revision of the indicators can be substantial. So we have to wait for to make sure that we're making the right call. Marcelle proposes a theoretical framework in which a formal underlying probability model is used to represent business cycles, generate coincident indicators, and infer probabilities of expansions and recessions. Her dynamic factor model combined with the Markov switching model with the objective that phases of the business cycle can be detected by probabilities assigned to states of the recession or recovery should be extremely interesting and useful for us. And she also says that it's very successful in calling turning points. And she also underlines the fact that it's been successful in applications for Mexico. So we're definitely looking forward to examining all the bibliography that I'm sure you're going to leave us about Mexico, because it's definitely something that I think should be a very important part that we have to consider in our new business cycle dating committee. I'm going to start out our discussion with a few questions, and then I will give Marcelle time to answer, and then we can take a few questions from the audience if you have any further questions. The one thing, question I think that I would definitely ask is that your methodology definitely outlines and advances the possibility or the probability that we are in a recession. When you see that, does the business cycle dating committee in Brazil come out and say so? There's a probability that there's a recession there. In other words, did you declare formally a recession watch status, or is it something that you just do internally, but you don't come out with maybe a press statement? I think this is a very important question for us to be able to see whether we just want to pinpoint turning points, or do we want to actually formally declare a recession watch and then have a follow-up to see whether that recession watch materializes or not. Also, another important question is our economy has experienced, as I said, a structural change because we've had a more than a 10-year drop in oil production. And as you know, Mexico was a very important net exporter of oil. But in 2015, the fact that we don't produce as much oil anymore has converted Mexico into a net importer of oil and oil derivatives. However, something very important in our composite indicators is that imports are included in the estimation of our composite index. And that means that there's a big risk of maybe dating the business cycle phase if we continue to use indicators that do not recognize these structural changes in their dynamics. And it's a question here is that how can we recognize and update and incorporate these structural changes in our reading of the business cycle to make sure that we're not confusing a structural change with a business cycle. And then just finally, and I think it's very clear to us that you favor the business cycle analysis framework. However, I would like to hear your comments on the growth cycle approach. We think that we can rescue it. We think that he doesn't have to stop producing it, but we do think that we should downplay its role as a complementary indicator to the business cycle approach, not substitute, but definitely as a complement. I would also like to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, thanks for your questions. So the first one is based on the CODACI experience, if Mexico should also have like a recession watch, and if we do have a recession watch or not, if we let the press know and the people whether the economy is weakening or not. We don't. We only say that announce the turning points. That's the committee role, because we don't want to get into the ins and outs and ons and ups and downs of the economy. Mainly because when you do that, you are relying on data that might be revised quite a bit, and then you start like getting lost into the trees in the forest. So we only release information about turning points, nothing else. But the members of the committee do have models, and they talk to the press. But they always say, this is my opinion, my model, it has nothing to do with the committee. Although the press tries to get us and mixed information, but for example, I have the model, and Paulo Piquet has a model too, and he talks a lot with the press, and he publishes the probability of recessions in the website. But sometimes it's accurate with what we think, sometimes it's not. And for example, the probability of recessions for his model were very high, basically saying that we were close to recession this past year. But the CODACI didn't think that we should issue a statement about it because we didn't have enough information, and now the economy is growing. So that's why we don't want to do that. But suppose that a model says that 60%, what are you going to do? Tell them? Then you're basically telling them that maybe there's a turning point. It's dangerous. You don't want to get into that. In terms of, you said that oil production in Mexico has decreased quite a bit. And since 2015, Mexico imports is a net importer of oil. But oil export continues to be an important part of GDP in Mexico.
Less and less.
But so what you have to do is calculate the fractions, even a new structure change. So what is the contribution of export to GDP? And what is the contribution of imports to consumption? Because imports is not in GDP, but it's going to be part of consumption. And that way, if you see that there is a time variance is reducing a lot in terms of contribution to GDP, then you can kind of put a time variance parameter to export. But, and the other thing that you mentioned, construction is going down in Mexico quite a bit. It is true in Brazil, too. So when we're trying to look at investment, why is investment going down so much? Why it's not recovering? Why has been so negative? And since the beginning of the recession in 2014 and the recession in 2016, but investment did not pick up. Everything else did. And we broke it down, and so construction is a major part of it. And the question is, what is the contribution of construction to investment? So it's not only excluding construction for industrial products, or you have to see how much it contributes to GDP. Look at how much. I don't know if you have data for that. We are trying to get data for that. So this is another thing that we do, is just study things like that too. So then try to do studies of the contribution of each one of these variables, and based on that, and if it's changing, model that structural break change if it's very significant. And the third question was about the growth cycle approach, but I'm not sure what you're doing in terms of the growth cycle approach. What is it? Can you explain a little bit?
The growth cycle approach, basically what it does is it calculates a composite index of coincidental indicators, and then it breaks down and filters out the trend, the noise, and seasonality, so that you just completely isolate the cyclical behavior of that index, and then you compare it with a long-run trend equal to 100, and then you kind of look at where the cycles are. The cycles are close to the mapping of your traditional classical approach, but they do differ a little bit. And we think that it can be complementary to the business approach, but some countries seem to base much more of their analysis on the growth cycle. The US definitely doesn't, and INEGI made the decision to put more emphasis on the growth cycle at the end of 2010, and they almost abandoned the business cycle approach, at least explicitly, even though they continue to calculate it. So my question is whether you think that we can still rescue the growth cycle approach, continue to monitor it, and just use it maybe as a complement to analyzing the traditional business cycle, or if you have any further thought about that.
Okay, so now I understand. Okay, so this is a very good question. When you look at the classical business cycle, it looks at the trend. And the reason is because that's a variable that you know. GDP is there, and that's what you know. When you take seasonality, you take the trend, and the method that you remove the trend can cause the cycle to be something completely different from the other. So the cycles that you got are dependent on how you remove the trend or how you remove the seasonality. So if you assume that's a linear trend, you assume that there's no stationary trend, did you take the breaks out of the trend before you transform in growth cycle? So that's very tricky, and I would suggest no, don't use growth cycles. Growth cycles also are very volatile, and how you're going to pinpoint things, that it depends how you detrend it to. When you detrend in some ways, it can be very volatile. There's a completely not volatile at all. And then if you don't take into account the structural breaks, there's a huge literature on that in the US. There's a paper published JME, Pierre Perron, and I forgot the other name, but I can give you later. But he just shows that if you consider breaks, and then if you don't, the cycle that comes out of that is totally different. One is like very smooth, the other is like all over the place. And one is like shows that the US is actually in a recession since the 1990s because they did not count the break in 1973. So, in other words, structural breaks affect how you remove the trend, and the cycle that you get out can be very dangerous. It might not be reflecting the economy at all. So that's why people use the classical business cycle. But having said that, you can use models that detrend automatically. But then you're taking the counter-structural breaks, and automatically that's the non-factor model is not looking at the trend, it's looking at the cycle. And then it gives the probability of recession in the growth cycle. But it is all embedded in the model, and it takes into account the structural breaks too. So I would say in terms of the classical definition of business cycle, I would use the trend. But to use models, then it doesn't matter. As long as in these models you are taking into account non stationarities. And then you know exactly how you remove. You should remove the trend in several different ways. Or just use the model to do that.
Okay, thank you. It's very helpful illustrating, and I would like to take any questions or comments from the audience at this point. Al fondo a la derecha, doctor.
Thanks. So this is a question for both of you. It seems to me that there's almost a divorce between the way we think about growth in economics, because most models tell us that in normal conditions, an economy is supposed to grow even in per capita terms, let alone in absolute terms. And then when we talk about dating economic cycles, the basic definitions are based on declines of output. So given that we expect economies to grow over the long term in equilibrium in normal conditions, why shouldn't we consider periods of low growth, i.e., growth below potential, where the gap between the actual and the potential growth is increasing, to be a part of a cycle? I don't know if we should give it another name different than recession, but it seems to be that would be very relevant, for example, in terms of fiscal policy, monetary policy, where we shouldn't necessarily wait for output to decrease for fiscal policy to become more expansionary. So how do you reconcile those two views?
So that's a very good point, very interesting question. I think that's very important, and I actually have models that do that. The thing about low growth is that it's much harder to detect a low growth than there is to detect a major fall. And the chance that you're going to signal something wrong is much higher. So, but there are countries that have, like Australia, they haven't had a recession in the last 30 years. So, yeah, they have to look at low growth versus high growth. But, they have a very stable economy. But then how to use mod? They cannot have models, even though they have low growth, that identifies those. So in terms of having a committee to identify, okay, so Mexico is not doing so well, we have a low growth. But if the committee comes and says, okay, everybody knows it's a low growth. The question is, what's going to happen next? A disaster? So you're not feeling too well. Is that going to become a cold? Or is going to be tuberculosis? We were more concerned about the tuberculosis than the cold, because the cold can be temporary, and you might not want it to be changing fiscal policy and monetary policy to something that is temporary and maybe not important. Suppose that you decided to decrease interest rate, but then inflation picks up, or you decided to go after inflation, and you have to kind of give up some things, but you cannot just, unless the growth is almost negative, and then the question is not if it's low growth, if it's a recession. But low growth is a very broad term. What does it mean? Below potential, what is the potential? The trend is changing over time. So the potential of Mexico in the 1970s is different from the 1980s, different from the 1990s. It's very hard to predict long run trend, because that, you can only predict after the fact. And then what if a recession pulled the trend down, and the trend now is much lower? And so policy is going to be too expansionary to try to bring the growth back. What if it doesn't? What if oil never going to be produced more? Or what if construction is not going to pick up? So you might make policies that become inflationary. So it's tricky. It's a good question, but it's much trickier to do fiscal policy, monetary policy for low growth than for recessions.
Thank you. Juan Carlos?
Congratulations. Thank you very much for coming here and illustrating us. Would you be kind enough to explain a little bit more about the work that is being done by the committee? I mean, it's obvious that what you're doing is great, but what would you do different, say, in terms of the way the committee operates, communicates, the way they choose the members? I mean, if you were right now designing the committee in Brazil, what would you do differently? What would you advise us in that sense? I mean, because right now we're starting from scratch. How many women? I mean, so we choose people from the north of Brazil, the north of Mexico, whatever, you name it. All those, I mean, the models are great. The software is brilliant.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Well, but I'd like to listen to her opinion anyway. She's a woman also, so why not?
I mean, as Bonomo, yeah, he's going to talk about that. I mean, how do we choose the economists? Yeah, he would talk about the whole thing. You choose the people who are expert in the area. I mean, if you have expert in the area who are women, yes. If you have men, yes. If you have dogs, yes. You're not selecting because of, it's good, but if you have women who are expert, but you don't have a contact with her, but you should go after her. What I'm saying is that you don't choose based on expertise, but of course don't want to have the boys' club either, and could be a women's club together. But in terms of choosing, everything was kind of organic. We had a lot of members that came in the beginning that decided not to be there, and others that came and went for some reason or other that Mark Bonomo is going to explain. But as he said, his whole presentation is going to be about that. So I don't want to take the spotlight.
Pablo?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Chauvet, for your presentation. I think it has been very interesting and illustrative for our purposes. I can see that you like more econometric models, of course, but I have a question about how to supplement this view of the Markov switching models. Because, for example, in the graph you show, in some recessions we have these up and downs of the probability of recession. I mean, there is a decline in the probability of recession in the middle of the recession, but CODACE has dated a recession in that period. So how do you supplement the information provided by the model with the fact that the economy is in fact in a recession? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. The decision in that particular recession, it was a subjective decision that one of our members was president of the central bank close to that time. He knew a lot of political things that were happening. So we basically there were two that were like that. There was the 1980s that happened, and the other one in the 1990s. So there was an impeachment happening. The economy went down quite a bit. There was a confiscation of money. So there was a history going around. And then the president after that, the economy went down quite a bit and recovered quite quickly, and then went down again. So then the model, I think, is more correct, because the model is reflecting what really happened. But the dating is not about this up and down. It's okay. First, you have to have the frequency. How long did it last, this up and down? So if we say, no, it's 5 months, the model is not doing that. I'm not forcing the model to have probabilities of recession going up for 6 months. I could do that. And then for that reason, you wouldn't be going up or down. But it's not one versus the other. It's a complementary. One is reflecting history. The other is reflecting history in a different way with much more information. the model has information on these 5 variables. The committee has historical facts and experience of that moment and say, well, this and that and that and that is happening, was happening. So it's not only this, but everything else. And then you have the frequency. Then we decide, well, let's just put it all to be one recession instead of a recession, just recovery recession. But that's, like, everyone's going to talk about that in Spain as well. They did something similar in Europe. It's a subjective decision by the committee. So you have the two complementing each other. It's not one is wrong, the other is wrong. It's both correct, just reflecting different information.
Yeah. Thank you, Marcelle, for your illuminating presentation and the clarity of your explanations. I have a question about the role of the committee vis-a-vis the models. Assume we have a good dynamic factor model, we have a good coincident and leading set of indicators that we can reasonably estimate the probability of a recession through models, and that all these models are available for the public to see. So what will be the role of a committee for dating cycles? What's the value added once you have all these instruments, in the case these instruments are good and are available to the public?
Okay, if I had access to the internet, I would show you why. One thing is for me to show you the smooth probability of recession, which is after the fact, you smooth backwards, knowing everything that happened. The other is the real-time probability of recession. So right now, we are in October, it's still October, and we have a data, we don't know what's happening right now. We're only gonna know what happened today, a month from today, because we don't have data on that. Or maybe 2 months from today, or maybe 3 months from today. Some of the data are available much later on. So in real time, prediction is a lot different. And so, okay, so today you have this, and then suppose like in 2 months we have the data. And then we have one little point going up. So what are you gonna do? It's just 1 point. And then if you release this information, the public actually did that in the US. The recession probability went from 2% to 3%. Right before the election, not the Trump one, before, and then they said, this is the first time that happened, and every time it went from 2 to 2% in the last 3 years is because there was a recession. So they look at 3 years, there was a recession before, and they use my model to say there will be a recession. And I hold on, that means that there is a 97% of an expansion. So people can get to these models and play political games or play in the market or just mess it up completely. But in real time, a little increase not going to say anything. Even if the model increases 50%, this is not a recession. A recession has to be 6 months, or at least 3 months of increased probability. So you're going to have rules after that. You had the model, you had the probabilities. What does the probability say? What does it mean? So it's not that clear cut. And I want you to do it yourself. Run this model and see what happens when you look in the real time. I have on my web page, I show the real-time probabilities of recession. It's very noisy. It's all over the place. So you have to extract that information and make it smooth. So it's, but in real time, you only have the last observation. So what are you going to do? You have to project forward. So.
Thank you very much, Marcelle, and thank everybody for being here. I think that your contribution to the start of this seminar has been very, very helpful. A lot of insight, a lot of things that we are taking notes, and I'm sure that we will continue in the previous panel. So I'd like to thank you, Marcelle, and please, everybody, give her a big hand.